On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sat down in front of a television camera and resigned. Not from a job, from a country. A country that no longer existed. 15 republics, 290 million people, 1/6 of the entire land surface of the planet. The second most powerful military force in human history. 10,000 nuclear warheads, gone, not through war, not through invasion, not through revolution in the streets, through paperwork. 3 men signed a document in a hunting lodge in the Beloveja forest and decided, between themselves, without asking anyone, that the Soviet Union was over. No vote, no referendum, no warning. One morning, the Soviet Union existed. By evening, it did not. And what happened in the years before that morning, the decisions, the miscalculations, the moments where everything could have gone differently, is one of the strangest stories of the 20th century. To understand how the Soviet Union collapsed, you need to understand what it actually was, not the version from textbooks, the real one. In the Soviet Union, the state was everything. The state decided where you worked. The state decided where you lived. The state decided what you read, what you watched, what you were allowed to believe. In the Soviet Union, there was no unemployment because everyone was employed by the state. There was no homelessness because the state owned every building. There was no inflation because the state set every price. On paper, it was a perfect system. In reality, it was a machine that had been running on inertia for decades, held together not by efficiency, but by fear, habit, and the memory of what happened to people who asked too many questions. In the Soviet Union, you didn't complain about the system. You learned to live inside it. You learned which lines to stand in, which officials to bribe, which topics to avoid at dinner. You built a second life, informal, invisible, entirely separate from the official one. Everyone knew the official version of reality was false. Nobody said so out loud. This was the Soviet Union in 1985 when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. He was 54 years old. He was the youngest member of the Politburo, and he understood something his predecessors had refused to admit. The machine was breaking down. The Soviet economy in 1985 was a quiet catastrophe. Oil prices had collapsed. Oil was the Soviet Union's primary source of hard currency, the money needed to buy technology, grain, and everything else the system couldn't produce itself. When oil prices fell, the budget fell with them. In the Soviet Union, the shelves in state stores were increasingly empty. Not everywhere. Not always, but enough that people noticed. Enough that the jokes got darker. In the Soviet Union, there was a saying, "We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us." The military was consuming 30% of the entire economy. Every year, 30% of everything the Soviet Union produced went into weapons, soldiers, and the machinery of confrontation with the West. And for what? Afghanistan. The Soviet Union had been fighting in Afghanistan since 1979. 6 years in, there was no victory in sight. Coffins were coming home, mothers were grieving, and nobody was allowed to say why. Gorbachev looked at all of this and made a decision that would end the Soviet Union. He decided to tell the truth. Glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring. 2 words that would eventually bring down the largest country on earth. The idea was simple. Acknowledge the problems, allow some criticism, let the system correct itself, control the process. What Gorbachev did not understand, what nobody understood, was that in the Soviet Union, truth was not a tool, it was a bomb. When the Soviet press was allowed to report honestly for the first time in decades, something extraordinary happened. People found out what had actually been happening. In the Soviet Union, there had been a famine in 1932 and 1933 that killed millions. The official history said it never happened. Now newspapers were writing about it. In the Soviet Union, Stalin had ordered the execution of hundreds of thousands of people. Party members, military officers, ordinary citizens. The official history called it necessary. Now survivors were speaking on television. In the Soviet Union, the gap between the official version of reality and actual reality had always existed. Glasnost made that gap visible, and once people could see it clearly, once they understood the scale of what had been hidden from them, something shifted that could not be unshifted. Trust, once broken, does not repair itself on schedule. Then came April 1986, Chernobyl. Reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded in the early hours of April 26th. In the Soviet Union, the first instinct of every official was the same instinct that had governed the system for 70 years. Hide it, minimize it, control the information. They tried. They failed. The radiation spread across Europe. Foreign governments were detecting it. The cover-up became impossible. And when the Soviet Union was finally forced to admit what had happened, when the world saw the scale of the disaster and the scale of the lie, something changed permanently in how Soviet citizens saw their own government. In the Soviet Union, you had always suspected the government lied to you about small things. Now you knew it was willing to lie to you about something that could kill your children. Chernobyl didn't cause the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it cracked something that was already fragile. In the Soviet Union, there were 15 republics. Each one was different. Different languages, different histories, different relationships with Moscow. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, had been independent countries before the Soviet Union absorbed them in 1940. In the Soviet Union, this history was not discussed. The official version said they had joined voluntarily. After Glasnost, that version became impossible to maintain. In 1989, 2 million people in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined hands and formed a human chain 600 kilometers long from Tallinn to Vilnius. They called it the Baltic Way. It was the largest human chain in history. They were not rioting. They were not fighting. They were simply standing together in silence, saying, "We remember who we are." In the Soviet Union, that was an act of revolution. The movement spread. Georgia, Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, republic after republic, people who had spent decades pretending to believe the official version of their own history began saying publicly what they had always known privately. Moscow didn't know what to do. The tools that had always worked, arrest, exile, fear, were no longer working the same way. Too many people, too visible. The world was watching. In the Soviet Union, the center was losing control of the edges, and when the edges go, the center follows. August 1991. Moscow. A group of hardliners within the Soviet government decided they had seen enough. Gorbachev had gone too far. The reforms were destroying everything. They placed him under house arrest in Crimea and announced that he was ill and temporarily unable to govern. It was a coup. In the Soviet Union, a coup like this would once have been straightforward. Announce it. Control the media. Wait for compliance. In the Soviet Union that had existed for 70 years, people complied. But this was not that Soviet Union anymore. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, Gorbachev's rival and eventual successor, climbed on top of a tank outside the Russian parliament building and gave a speech, live, on television. He called the coup illegal. He called on soldiers to disobey orders. He called on citizens to resist. In the Soviet Union, standing on a tank and telling soldiers to disobey orders was suicide. Yeltsin survived. The coup collapsed within 3 days. The plotters had miscalculated everything. The military refused to fire on civilians. The KGB refused to move against Yeltsin. The Soviet Union's own security apparatus declined to save it. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but he returned to a different country. The coup had destroyed the last remaining authority of the Soviet center. If the system couldn't even protect itself from a coup launched by its own people, what exactly was it protecting? December 1991. Belovezha Forest, Belarus. 3 men sat down in a hunting lodge. Boris Yeltsin of Russia, Leonid Kravchuk of Ukraine, Stanislav Shushkevich of Belarus. They had no legal authority to do what they were about to do. The Soviet Union had a constitution. It had laws about how it could be dissolved. None of those laws were followed. They signed a document, the Bellavazia Accords. It declared that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist and was replaced by a commonwealth of independent states. Then they called Gorbachev and told him. They also called the President of the United States before they called Gorbachev. George H.W. Bush received the news before the leader of the country being dissolved. On December 25th, Gorbachev went on television and resigned. That evening, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Russian tricolor went up in its place. In the Soviet Union, this moment had been unthinkable. In the Soviet Union, the state was permanent, eternal, inevitable. In the Soviet Union, you were taught from birth that the system would outlast everything. It lasted 74 years, less than a human lifetime. What followed was not freedom, not immediately, not for most people. The Soviet Union had controlled prices for 70 years. When price controls were removed overnight, inflation exploded. In 1992, prices in Russia rose by 2,500%. Savings that people had accumulated over entire lifetimes became worthless in months. In the Soviet Union, everyone had had a job. Now factories closed, farms collapsed. Men who had spent 30 years working in the same plant found themselves with nothing. The life expectancy of Russian men dropped by 6 years in a single decade. The Soviet Union's vast military infrastructure, the weapons, the technology, the nuclear arsenal, was suddenly distributed across 15 different countries, some of which had no idea what to do with it. The question of who controlled the nuclear weapons was not resolved for months. Entire cities that had existed only to serve Soviet military or industrial purposes found themselves without reason to exist. People stayed because there was nowhere to go. In the Soviet Union, you always knew what tomorrow looked like. It looked like today. The same job, the same apartment, the same lines, the same shelves, the same gray predictability. After the Soviet Union, nobody knew what tomorrow looked like. For some people, that was freedom. For most people, for a long time, it was terrifying. Mikhail Gorbachev lived until 2022. He died at 91 years old. In the West, he was celebrated. The man who ended the Cold War. The man who freed Eastern Europe. The man who chose not to send tanks when the Berlin Wall fell. In Russia, he was never forgiven. To many Russians, Gorbachev was the man who destroyed their country, their savings, their certainty, their place in the world. Both versions are true. The Soviet Union was a system built on a lie, the lie that the state could manage everything, know everything, control everything, and that this control was good for the people inside it. For 70 years, that lie held, not because people believed it exactly, but because the cost of not believing it was too high. Gorbachev lowered that cost. He made it possible to say out loud what everyone already knew, and what everyone already knew was enough to bring the whole thing down. The Soviet Union did not collapse because it was attacked. It did not collapse because its people rose up in violent revolution. It collapsed because one day the gap between the official version of reality and actual reality became too wide to maintain. And in the end, that is how most lies die. Not with a bang, with the slow, quiet accumulation of things that can no longer be unsaid.